Hi, this is the final podcast assignment for ED577, Project-Based Learning. My name is Anthony Pena. I will be your host, and my project that I will be talking about is Data Makes a Difference, which is a project aimed at getting students to decide on something they'd like to see change in the community, develop a data-driven plan to achieve that, and then to find the appropriate audience to present their case to begin to affect that change in their community. The intention here is for this to be a high school statistics project. And so some of the standards that it focuses on from the Common Core standards, really, honestly, as I was, it can be almost any of the data analysis standards in high school statistics could potentially be used. I wanted to highlight the ones that I thought were at the heart of the spirit of the project. So ones like distinguishing between correlation and causation, understanding statistics as a process for making inferences about population parameters based on a random sample from that population, evaluating reports based on data, representing data on two quantitative variables on a scatter plot, and describing how the variables are related. The sort of correlation, causation, inference, and the interrelationship between variables was really at the heart of where I started with this, and even as it evolved, that's still the core, even though it really could draw in any of the statistical analysis standards. As far as some of the other standards for the non-mathematical side of things, from the ISTE standards, the one that jumped out as being what I thought closest to the spirit of the project. There are several that apply, but the creative communicator from ISTE was the one that I thought really reflected, I think, a huge part of the spirit of the problem. So students communicate clearly and express themselves creatively for a variety of purposes using the platforms, tools, styles, formats, and digital media appropriate to their goals. Right? Since this project is about making a case and then communicating it, I thought that the idea that they would have to be intentional about how they create their communications was really central to the scope of the project. As far as how the planning process affected my thinking, the biggest thing was the process of defining the driving question that would then lead to how the project unfolded. And early on, I had a very rudimentary idea just about causal inference in general, right? But changing the focus based on some feedback from Dr. Jablonski and from classmates, changing the focus to a community improvement project helped me see that being too focused on just the causal inference was limiting the way students could apply what they were learning and how they could engage authentically with it. It was just about knowledge construction, and it was open-ended, but it wasn't, it didn't have that way of giving students a way to bring themselves into it, right? And so once it was about community, I saw that I could achieve the same coverage of causal inference and the other standards I talked about within the broader scope of just making a data-driven case for something the students are passionate about. So when they're gathering data and trying to make a rationale for putting a plan in place, they're going to encounter causal inference along the way. But they'll also be able to encounter other methods of processing and interacting with data. Switching to the community aspect also helped with the real world skills side of things. So, as we learned in our text about skills like collaboration, communication, reflection, problem solving, revision, stuff like that, the focus on the community and the communication piece really changed so much of how readily that stuff would be a part of the project. They're trying to engage the public. They have to consider what part of the public and how that audience might need to be communicated with, how local government might work, how campaigning works. All of those things are collaborative and they're communicative. They require problem solving, and they really ask you to reflect on what you achieve through those different means. And all of that can be done while still applying their mathematical learning to the argument itself for the plan using the data. So the way that the criteria from our texts and from our other readings were incorporated, I've outlined a little bit kind of in what I just said, but just to be clear, the authenticity and the motivation comes from that idea of like engaging with your immediate environment and your community and finding something that you're passionate about there. Leaving it open sort of fits that idea of the ill-defined task, which to me is I'll talk a little bit later about what a revelation that was to me in terms of thinking about projects. but it is open-ended, and they're given an ill-defined task, but then there's the structure in place for them to explore it and to hit certain milestones along the way, so that it's not an ill-defined process, but just here is the sort of open-ended thing, and now run with it. And then, of course, that connects to the idea of the milestones, right? If you're given something that is open-ended, you need to make sure that students are able to sort of hit milestones along the way, so it's not just a big ambiguous sort of task. And so the milestones really helped me to see how I could set up that open-ended, ill-defined beginning and let them move through it at a pace that will support them. The idea also of producing some public product. Once this was about engaging with the public, the idea that you would have to produce something publicly naturally fell into place. So that was another criterion that the project hit. And then the last one to sort of fall into place, I got some feedback on my project sketch that was about the need to incorporate more feedback and reflection. And so what I did with that is as I re-examined the sketch and the milestones, and that I tried to insert feedback, reflection, and revision into each milestone itself as well, since everything, each time they're working towards a project that has so many facets to it. Each one I felt was warranting its own sort of, okay, now test this out, have an audience, see how it goes, revise, reflect, and then because everything builds off of each milestone. So each one needed its own iterative reflection and revision process. So that was another key aspect of the criteria that helped me sort of shape the project. What I've learned that I can utilize in the future, I think the biggest thing is the structuring and the pacing of learning after setting that initial ill-defined task to avoid fear that the students won't know what to do, that they're not independent enough, that they will sort of flounder. I think, that was one of the hesitations I expressed early in the course, and I really feel like I've learned a lot about how to overcome that. I think also learning how to evaluate the authenticity of a project, which connects to one of the other prompts about how projects that I've been accustomed to seeing, that aren't necessarily informed by PBL practices, really are too rigid, right? And so the main thing I would say about the difference between project-based learning and projects as I have known them is that project-based learning is not that rigid sort of like, here's the setup, here's every step along the way, here's what you're going to do, here's what you're going to read, here's what you're going to produce, where it's all already decided ahead of time. And really, if there is student choice, it very often is something that's merely aesthetic. I can think of a couple examples of old projects from early on in my career where, in a geometry class we did tessellations, and really the only choice they had was what they drew inside of the pattern they were tessellating. And I also, in middle school, I remember really early on doing a volume and surface area project where students created some sort of packaging for a product, and it was only aesthetic considerations in terms of choice. And I think I had explored potentially doing something like that earlier on and having more choice built into it. And that might be something I return to in the future. But yeah, all of those projects are just way too rigid, and they end up becoming just plodding through tasks instead of sort of like achieving milestones, so to speak. So yeah, and that actually ties to, I think, something else that I can use, and that is the idea of consciously creating these milestones. The way that it sort of breaks a larger project, and this one could, I imagine, feel quite large to a student, but it breaks everything down into a mini project, right? Everything is produce this at the end of this milestone, produce this, and each of those things has its part in the larger project, but also it's fairly self-contained as far as what the student needs to focus on at the moment, right? There's not a lot of overlap, and they can kind of move from one step to the other. So that consciousness of the microcosm that each milestone is really helped me develop the sketch and the overview of the project. And I would imagine that would feed future projects as well. Additionally, I think the focus on refining the driving question is really important to maintaining that sense of having an ill-defined task while also nurturing students' need to engage authentically and to find themselves motivated by the question. It's a razor's edge I think, but it's key to any project that the driving question be just vague enough to allow students that way to engage authentically and to bring themselves into it, but also specific enough that it's not overwhelming or unmotivating. Yeah, very much seems like a fine line. The last valuable thing I want to highlight is that reflection and revision. The importance of building that resilience to stay with their work, to make it better, to listen to feedback from peers and from teachers, I think can't be overstated. In our current structure, I feel like there's a lot of you kind of do something and then you move on. And there's sort of this conveyor belt where you're just constantly like chewing through things and then moving on to the next thing. And that can train students to treat everything they produce as sort of like a throwaway item that then they move on to the next. And so I think that idea of slowing down, saying this is a good product, it needs a little work, go back, that iterative process is I think such a valuable real world skill that can apply to anything that you're doing in your life, whether it's, parenting or communication skills at work. There's just always this like feedback and revision process that is part of life, beyond school. I think, in terms of what I learned and how it might change how I strategize for a future project, I think the best thing that I can say is that to step away from thinking first about the content and the standards and things like that, and to look at it first from authenticity. And how do you start with authenticity and move towards the standards? So it's like inverting the sort of what I think is the way that we're to some extent trained in teaching school, where it's like, okay, here are the content standards. How can we motivate students to do A, B, C, or D? Rather than what's something the students are motivated to do, and how does that thing that they're motivated to do connect to standards, right? So start with motivation, end with content. That was a huge eye-opener for me in terms of how to think about a project being meaningful to students. In terms of the way that students can make a difference in the world using project-based learning methods, I think there's a few things. So one, the idea that public products are a central part of project-based learning speaks to the way that it's about engaging, right? So they're practicing engaging in the real world. It's not like a classroom laboratory thing. It's not abstract in a vacuum type learning. The process demands engagement, which even if a specific project doesn't make the difference in the world that it was expecting, it still puts into the world a student who has practiced engaging and has learned from the experience. If all of the students the world over are in classrooms, in schools, practicing engaging the real world, then those schools will put into the world students who have practice with the world itself, and it won't be such a disconnect between, well, that's how it is in school and this is how it is in the real world. In fact, it could potentially just like blur the definitions of those things altogether. So all in all, this was an extremely informative class, and I feel like I've learned a ton about what it would take to implement project-based learning in the classroom, and some of the fears I expressed early on about students being able to engage and to be a guide or a facilitator for that. I think those have sort of evaporated, and I feel much more confident about being able to create an experience for a student that would be meaningful.